In 18 minutes, 240 vehicles stopped moving forever. There was no battle for the road, no counterattack, no desperate last stand. One moment, a column was advancing through the early morning light. Minutes later, it no longer existed as a fighting force. At 06:57 hours, German vehicles rolled forward in a clean, disciplined line. Trucks, half-tracks, fuel carriers, steel stretched along a narrow road that cut through open ground. The sky was clear. The air was still. There were no aircraft overhead, no artillery fire in the distance, only engines and the low rattle of equipment. It felt routine. It felt safe. That silence was the first deception. The column remained tightly packed, each vehicle keeping close distance with the one ahead. Drivers stayed seated. Infantry rode exposed, rifles resting against canvas sides, helmets loosened in the cool air. Some men smoked. Others watched the roadside drift past without urgency. The greatest threat, they believed, came from above. The ground had offered no warning. Then the first shell landed. It fell short, exploding ahead of the lead vehicles. Dirt and stone rose into the air, no direct hit, no immediate casualties. For a few seconds it looked like an error, an artillery round misjudged, fired too quickly, too soon. Engines did not stop. The column continued moving. The second shell did not miss. It struck a truck near the center of the formation. Metal tore open. Fuel ignited. The explosion hurled debris across the road and brought movement to an abrupt halt. Burning wreckage blocked the route in both directions. Vehicles slammed to a stop with nowhere to go. Confidence vanished instantly. The silence that had suggested safety was replaced by something far worse, the calm, deliberate rhythm of incoming fire. Smoke climbed into the morning air. Men began to understand that this was not a chance encounter. The road had been chosen, and whatever decision had brought them here was already irreversible. The first explosions felt sudden. The pattern that followed did not. From somewhere beyond the horizon, hidden by folds of ground and careful distance, Allied observers were already watching the road as if it were a firing range. They did not need to guess where the column was going. A straight road offers only one promise, that vehicles must remain on it and therefore can be predicted. Their maps were not sketches. They were instruments. Distances had been calculated in advance, angles marked, reference points chosen, trees, bends, culverts, mile markers, features so ordinary no driver would ever notice them. But to men with binoculars and range tables, those small details were measurement itself. The German vehicles became the final coordinates. A lead truck, a fuel carrier, a command car, each one served as a moving reference point, confirming what the observers already knew. When the first round landed short, it was not failure. It was a question asked with powder and steel. The road answered immediately. Correction came fast. A few seconds, a slight adjustment, and the next shell arrived closer. The line tightened not by choice, but by habit, vehicles compressing as drivers braked, waiting for orders that did not come. With every impact, the gun crews refined their aim. The bursts began to walk along the column with a cold logic, each hit improving the next. Then the Germans understood what made it terrifying. This was not a barrage thrown in anger. It was controlled fire, observed, corrected, repeated. The accuracy was not luck, it was method, and method meant the enemy had time, confidence, and a plan. In that moment, the road ceased to be a route. It became a grid. Men looked for the guns and found nothing, only distance, only unseen eyes. They had entered a space already measured for their destruction, and the shells were merely the confirmation. And still, worse than the explosions, was the realization forming in the smoke. The Allies had waited for a reason, because the true trap required the column to commit itself completely. What frightened the survivors most was not that the guns had found them. It was that the guns had waited. For a professional artillery force, restraint is not hesitation, it is doctrine. The Allies did not open fire at first contact because first contact was not the goal. A column can scatter if struck early. Vehicles can reverse, turn into fields, disappear into hedgerows, dissolve into smaller targets. The enemy had learned, often the hard way, that the most efficient moment to fire is not when a target appears, but when it can no longer escape. So the observers watched the road fill. They allowed the German column to stretch itself out in daylight, vehicle after vehicle, committing to the same narrow strip of asphalt. The longer it grew, the more it resembled a chain, and a chain only has to be broken once to become useless. To the Germans, the earlier quiet had seemed like weakness. No air attack, no immediate shelling, no resistance at the first bend. It suggested that the enemy was slow, disorganized, perhaps already retreating. In modern war, men often mistake patience for absence. But silence can be engineered. A waiting gun line is not idle. It is calculating. Gun crews are trained to hold fire until the observer confirms the best point of collapse, until the road's geometry, the spacing of vehicles, and the terrain's limits all align. That is how artillery turns from a weapon into a system. When the first shell fell short, the column did not scatter. When the second struck the center, it could not. And suddenly, the options that had existed minutes earlier were gone. Forward movement was blocked by fire and wreckage. Reverse movement was sealed by the same narrow road now choked with vehicles. Leaving the road meant open ground, soft shoulders, ditches, fields that would trap wheels and bog tracks. Even escape demanded time, and time was the one resource the enemy controlled. Fear does not always arrive with screams. Sometimes it arrives as arithmetic. Men began to count seconds between impacts. They watched smoke drift and realized it made them more visible, not less. They listened for the next incoming round and understood this trap had been built out of silence, and they had walked into it willingly. And the more they tried to understand why the Allies had waited, the clearer the answer became. The waiting had been the first strike. To understand why the column moved so openly, you have to understand what the road represented to German doctrine. For years, German operational thinking had treated speed as a form of protection. Movement was not merely logistics, it was control. Roads were lines of authority, channels through which orders became reality. To seize a road was to seize time, and to seize time was to unmake an enemy's plans before they could solidify. This belief had been reinforced by victories that came fast and seemed to reward boldness. In Poland, in France, even in the early months of the invasion of the Soviet Union, rapid columns had carved through confusion and reached objectives before resistance could properly form. The lesson, repeated in staff rooms and field briefings, was simple. Delay invites danger. Momentum solves it. Dispersion, by contrast, felt like weakness. A spread-out column is harder to command, slower to resupply, slower to assemble for action. It looks cautious, and caution did not match the identity the German army had built around itself. Tight spacing meant cohesion. Cohesion meant speed. Speed meant survival. It was a logic that had worked, often enough to become instinct. Terrain added to the illusion. A firm road through open ground appears reliable. It feels like certainty in a world that is usually mud, broken bridges, and ambiguous maps. And when a route looks clean, officers begin to trust it the way a sailor trusts calm water, forgetting that calm water can conceal a current strong enough to drag a ship under. Somewhere inside the command vehicle, near the center of the column, a senior officer accepted the morning quiet as proof that the risk had passed. The decision to move in daylight did not feel reckless. It felt practical. It felt like the enemy had been pushed back far enough that speed could be regained. In war, belief is rarely declared. It is assumed. And once assumed, it hardens into habit. Orders follow habit. Columns follow orders. The road becomes the plan. But a plan built on past success can be the most fragile kind, because it trains a man to recognize only the dangers he has already survived. And on this road, the danger was not one they were used to seeing until the guns began to teach it. By the time the column moved onto the road, German attention was already focused elsewhere. Air power had reshaped their understanding of danger. Fighters and bombers had become the most visible threat, fast, loud, and destructive. When losses occurred, they came from the sky. Roads were attacked by aircraft, convoys broken by strafing runs, bridges destroyed by bombs. Artillery, by contrast, felt slower, predictable, easier to avoid. That assumption proved costly. Allied ground guns were not scattered weapons firing in isolation. They were part of a coordinated system, observers, maps, radios, and gun crews trained to operate as a single mechanism. But much of German intelligence still treated them as secondary threats, fixed in place and slow to react. Reports lagged behind reality. The enemy had evolved. Confidence dulled curiosity. Because Allied air power drew attention upward, the ground was trusted by default. German planners believed that if no aircraft appeared, the risk had passed. They underestimated the reach of artillery and overestimated their own ability to outrun it. Speed, once again, was expected to compensate for exposure. Coordination was dismissed as well. The idea that multiple Allied batteries could be linked, supplied, and controlled with precision did not fit older assumptions. Such efficiency was thought to belong to German doctrine alone. The enemy, it was believed, lacked the discipline to sustain controlled fire under pressure. That belief survived long after it had stopped being true. And so the column stayed packed. Spacing was not increased. Alternate routes were not explored. Vehicles remained close enough to communicate by hand signals, close enough to feel orderly, close enough to appear strong. What looked like confidence from inside the formation looked very different from a distant observation post. Arrogance rarely announces itself. It hides inside familiar logic, inside conclusions drawn from old victories. By the time the first shells confirmed the error, adaptation required time, and time was already owned by the guns. The road, once assumed to be a shield, had become a channel, and through that channel, Allied artillery delivered a lesson the column was unprepared to learn. When the column stopped moving, no one immediately understood what that stillness meant. Drivers stayed inside their vehicles, hands on steering wheels, engines idling or dead. Years of training had taught them that armor, even thin steel, was safer than open ground. Leaving a truck felt like abandoning protection. So they waited, listening to distant impacts, watching smoke drift forward along the road. The infantry had no such shelter. Men crouched beside canvas-sided trucks or pressed themselves against wheels and axles, knowing it offered little protection. The road provided no cover, only exposure. Fields on either side looked open and soft, broken by ditches that promised to trap anyone who tried to flee. Staying felt dangerous. Moving felt worse. Officers hesitated. Orders require clarity, and clarity was absent. The fire did not come all at once. It arrived in intervals, measured, deliberate, giving the illusion that there was time to think. That illusion kept men in place longer than they should have been. Radios crackled, then fell silent under interference and damage. Runners were considered, then delayed. Every decision cost seconds. Medics prepared, without knowing where to go. They gathered supplies beside vehicles already marked by smoke, aware that any movement drew attention. Wounded men were treated where they lay, because carrying them anywhere else meant crossing open ground already watched by unseen eyes. Near the center of the column, the senior command element delayed its decision. The instinct to maintain control, to avoid chaos, competed with the growing reality that order itself had become the problem. Dispersion now might save lives, but dispersion meant losing cohesion, losing communication, losing command. And so time passed. With each minute the danger multiplied. Mori vehicles burned. Mori wreckage narrowed the road. The guns continued their work, unhurried, precise. Control did not vanish all at once. It thinned. What had been a disciplined formation began to feel like a collection of individuals, each calculating survival alone. The belief that had brought them here, faith in speed, in armor, in the road, was still present, but it was failing. And failure in war is rarely loud at first. It begins quietly, while men are still waiting for permission to move. While the column struggled to understand what was happening, the men behind the guns already did. From concealed positions, Allied observers spoke calmly into their radios. Corrections were short, technical, unemotional. A few meters left, 50 meters long. Fire for effect. The language of artillery is not dramatic, it is precise, and precision was now closing around the road. Gun tables replaced guesswork. Each adjustment shortened the margin of error. The intervals between impacts became predictable, not to those under fire, but to those delivering it. The rhythm settled into something steady, almost mechanical. Shells arrived where vehicles had stopped, then where they tried to move again. Every correction narrowed the space in which survival was possible. Smoke began to interfere with German communications. Radios failed or filled with static. Aerials were cut. Signals meant to impose order vanished into noise. But for the gunners, smoke was useful. It marked wreckage. It confirmed hits. It showed exactly where the road had been sealed. The geometry of the route did the rest. A straight road limits options. Ditches confined movement. Soft ground punished heavy vehicles that tried to leave the pavement. Intersections, few and exposed, became predictable escape points. Those, too, were shelled. What had once been a path became a corridor, then a cage. Command confusion spread unevenly. Some units tried to reverse. Others pushed forward into burning wrecks. A few attempted to fan out into the fields and learned, within seconds, why the road had been chosen as the kill zone. Each attempt at initiative revealed another layer of preparation waiting to absorb it. Artillery does not chase. It denies space, and by denying the road, the guns denied the column its purpose. Movement stopped not because every vehicle was destroyed, but because none could move without being seen and measured. By now, the Germans were no longer facing an ambush. They were inside a system designed to remove options one by one. And as the fire continued with unwavering discipline, it became clear that the road itself was no longer neutral ground. It belonged to the guns. The first destroyed vehicles were not only losses, they were barriers. A single wreck on a narrow road can be cleared. Two can slow a column for an hour. But when burning trucks collapsed across the pavement, twisted frames, shattered wheels, cargo spilling into ditches, the road stopped being a route and became an obstruction course made of metal. Drivers tried to inch forward, then stopped again. Reverse movement was worse. Vehicles behind could not see what blocked them ahead. They only saw smoke, heard impacts, and felt panic compress the column tighter. Some trucks stalled, others collided. The road filled with dead engines and trapped men. Tanks could not simply leave the pavement. Their weight punished soft ground, and the shoulders were cut by ditches. A tracked vehicle might climb out, if it had room, if the angle was right, if it was not already boxed in. But room did not exist. Steel sat against steel, each vehicle denying the next any space to maneuver. Fuel trucks ignited with particular cruelty. When their cargo caught fire, it did not burn quickly. It burned steadily, spreading heat and smoke along the column like a slow wave. Ammunition in nearby vehicles began to cook off, turning individual wrecks into unpredictable explosions. Men learned to fear not only incoming shells, but what their own supplies could become. Engineers attempted clearance. They moved forward with tools and explosives, trying to drag wreckage aside, trying to cut a path through debris. But artillery did not need to destroy engineers to stop them. It only needed to land close enough to force them down, to break their rhythm, to make every approach a gamble. Intersections became targets. Any point where the road might release the column into side routes was shelled, because those were the only veins through which movement could return. The result was simple. The road held the column in place, and the guns punished any attempt to escape it. Panic did not arrive all at once. It built as men realized a physical truth. There was no way forward without clearing fire. No way back without compressing into wreckage, and no way out without becoming a target in open ground. The road had become a cage, and inside that cage, the struggle shifted from mission to survival, from strategy to breath. Understanding did not arrive with a revelation. It arrived with subtraction. Near the center of the trapped column, the senior commander began to see what was no longer possible. Movement could not be restored. Communication could not be repaired. Time could not be recovered. Each option removed itself as the fire continued until only one conclusion remained. The road had been lost. The order for dispersion was given late. Not because it was wrong, but because it was dangerous. Dispersion meant abandoning vehicles, breaking units apart, and accepting that command would be fractured. It meant admitting that the doctrine which had brought the column here could no longer protect it. For a moment too long, control had been valued over survival. Messengers were sent when radios failed. They ran forward and backward along the road, carrying shouted instructions and handwritten notes. Many did not return. The road was already mapped in shell bursts, and men moving on foot were easier to correct onto than vehicles that could still shift position. Signals collapsed unevenly. Some units received orders, others never did. A company might disperse while the next remained mounted, unaware that permission to abandon vehicles had been granted. Cohesion dissolved not through panic, but through inconsistency. Each fragment of the column began to act on partial information. Leadership, once centralized, thinned into pockets. Junior officers made decisions they were never meant to make. NCOs pulled men into ditches or pushed them into fields without knowing if it was safe. Rank still existed, but authority did not travel far. The guns had severed it. At some point, survival replaced strategy entirely. Men stopped asking where they were going and began asking only how to avoid the next impact. Equipment was dropped without ceremony. Vehicles were left with engines running or doors open, frozen in the last moment of usefulness they would ever have. The general understood the truth that artillery enforces better than any weapon. When fire controls space, command becomes theoretical. What remained of leadership now served a single purpose: to give men permission to stop obeying the plan. And by the time that permission reached them, the plan itself had already ceased to exist. The tempo of the guns increased not with urgency, but with confidence. Once the road was sealed and movement reduced to isolated attempts, Allied artillery shifted into sustained fire. This was no longer correction. It was execution. Gun crews settled into a rhythm they had trained for: load, fire, adjust, repeat, each cycle feeding the next with data confirmed by observation. Ammunition detonations began to multiply. Vehicles packed with fuel, shells, and spare parts turned into secondary weapons. Explosions erupted without warning, flinging fragments across the road and into adjacent fields. Men learned that even surviving an incoming round offered no guarantee of safety. What burned behind them could kill them just as efficiently. No air support arrived. Whether delayed, denied, or simply unaware, the absence mattered. For the Germans, air cover had been the expected counter to artillery, fighters to disrupt observers, bombers to silence gun lines. But the sky remained empty. The battle was being decided entirely by guns on the ground. Infantry began to abandon equipment. Heavy weapons were dragged into ditches and then left behind. Radios were smashed to prevent capture or simply discarded when they became dead weight. Vehicles that might have been saved were emptied and deserted as fire intensified around them. Units dissolved quietly. There was no formal retreat, no coordinated withdrawal. The column ceased to function not because every man was killed, but because the structure that made them a unit could not survive under sustained observation and fire. This was the turning point. After this moment, recovery was no longer possible. Even if the guns stopped, even if a path opened, the column no longer had the cohesion to use it. The road was filled with burning proof that momentum had failed. Artillery had done what it is designed to do when used patiently and precisely. It had not merely destroyed vehicles. It had erased the idea that the column could still exist. The road burned for hours, long after the column stopped being a column. Vehicles did not die quickly. They smoldered, then flared, then collapsed inward as heat warped frames and ammunition cooked off in irregular bursts. The fires carried their own light, visible across open ground, an accidental beacon marking the place where movement had ended. Survivors stopped thinking in formations. Men fled individually or in small clusters, slipping into ditches, crawling through fields, moving when the gaps between impacts allowed. Some ran without weapons. Others carried only what could be held close to the body. Discipline did not vanish. It was simply overruled by the simple requirement of staying alive. A withdrawal was ordered, but it arrived too late to shape events. The command had already fractured, and the roads behind were no longer safe. Escape routes were shelled with the same deliberate logic that had sealed the column in the first place. The enemy did not need to pursue closely. Fire could reach further than men. Losses accumulated quietly. There were no dramatic charges, no heroic counterblows, no last-minute breakthroughs. The destruction was methodical, almost impersonal. It did not reward courage. It did not punish cowardice. It punished presence, being on the road when the guns decided the road would no longer be used. By late morning, what remained was not a battlefield in the traditional sense. It was wreckage arranged by physics and planning, vehicles frozen at odd angles, cargo spilled and burning, bodies lying where movement had ended. The column had been erased without the kind of fight soldiers are trained to imagine. And that was the climax of the trap. Not the violence itself, but the realization that an entire formation could be removed from the war without a battle, without even seeing the enemy who destroyed it. The road had promised passage. Instead, it became a place where an army learned what modern firepower could do when it was given time, and when a single decision placed men exactly where the guns wanted them. What happened on that road was not only a disaster, it was a demonstration. For decades, military culture had treated maneuver as the defining language of war, movement as intelligence, speed as superiority, the ability to outflank and outpace as the mark of a modern army. But artillery has always carried a quieter argument, that firepower, properly directed, can make maneuver irrelevant. On this road, that argument became undeniable. The Allies proved that coordination could defeat speed. Observers, maps, radios, and disciplined gun crews formed a single organism, one that did not need to see the enemy up close to destroy him. The column moved as a unit, but the guns fought as a system. And systems, when refined, do not rely on improvisation. They rely on procedure. Patience became a weapon, as tangible as steel. By waiting until the column committed fully, the Allies ensured that each shell produced more than casualties. It produced obstruction, panic, and paralysis. A vehicle destroyed in the right place mattered more than several destroyed at random. Firepower was not measured only in explosive weight, but in the ability to shape space. German assumptions collapsed under that pressure. They had treated the road as a tool, an artery to push forces forward. They had treated tight spacing as strength. They had treated artillery as a secondary threat. The guns proved each belief wrong in the most efficient way possible by punishing it. The engagement was recorded clinically. In artillery logs, it would appear as times, corrections, ammunition expended, targets struck, numbers that made destruction look orderly. That is one of modern war's most unsettling features, that catastrophe can be reduced to data without changing its meaning. And what replaced the old myth was not simply fear, but a shift in logic. War was becoming less forgiving of arrogance, less impressed by momentum, more governed by precision. The road had revealed a new hierarchy, not the boldest move, but the best measured one. And if the Germans could not adapt to that hierarchy, then this was not merely a lost column. It was a warning, written in craters, about the kind of war that was now taking shape. When the firing stopped, the accounting began. The road was walked slowly, not to search for enemies, but to count what no longer existed. Vehicles were identified by fragments, chassis numbers burned into frames, unit markings half melted into steel. Trucks, half-tracks, fuel carriers, command vehicles, each was recorded, then crossed off. By the end, the tally told a blunt story. Hundreds of vehicles rendered useless in less than an hour. But machines were the simplest loss to measure. Crews could not be replaced as easily. Drivers trained to handle heavy vehicles under fire. Mechanics who understood engines that no longer existed. Signalmen who knew the rhythms of their units. Their absence did not show up immediately on a map, but it hollowed out everything that followed. Supply chains fractured. Fuel meant for forward units burned on the road. Ammunition meant for future battles detonated in place. Rations, spare parts, medical stores, all lost in a single afternoon. The damage extended far beyond the wreckage itself, rippling backward through units that would now wait, delay, and improvise. A report was filed. It avoided emotion. It avoided blame. It listed causes, conditions, and outcomes in language designed to survive scrutiny. The tone was restrained, almost defensive. There were no excuses left to offer, only explanations that arrived too late to change anything. Momentum was gone. Not paused, not slowed, removed. Operations planned around that column had to be reconsidered or abandoned entirely. Timetables slipped. Opportunities closed. The war did not stop, but it adjusted, quietly, unforgivingly. This was not a dramatic defeat, with banners and surrender. It was administrative damage of the most serious kind, the loss of capability. And capability, once destroyed, does not regenerate on command. The numbers told the truth. The guns had already delivered. What was lost on that road could not be repaired quickly, and some of it could not be replaced at all. And that permanence was the real cost. The Allies did not treat the destruction as an anomaly. They treated it as confirmation. Reports were studied, not for spectacle, but for refinement. Fire plans were adjusted. Observer training was emphasized. Roads were no longer seen simply as routes of advance, but as potential traps, spaces where geometry, visibility, and discipline could be fused into decisive advantage. Dispersion became standard. Columns learned to break themselves apart before the enemy could do it for them. Spacing increased. Movement slowed. What looked inefficient on paper proved survivable in practice. The lesson was not subtle. Order invites destruction when firepower is precise enough to exploit it. German response was slower. Doctrine resists change when it has been built on success. The instinct to move fast, to trust cohesion, to impose control through momentum did not disappear easily. Even as evidence accumulated, habit remained powerful. Adaptation arrived unevenly, and often too late. The war itself grew harsher. Technology reduced the margin for error. Artillery, once seen as support, increasingly dictated outcomes. The battlefield punished confidence that was not matched by measurement. It rewarded those who waited, watched, and chose the moment of commitment carefully. Arrogance had found its counter. Not in bravery or numbers, but in mathematics and patience. Guns did not argue, they demonstrated. Every crater along the road marked a conclusion reached by calculation rather than emotion. And still, lessons do not enforce themselves. They must be accepted. They must be institutionalized. And when they are not, war repeats its instructions in increasingly unforgiving ways. This road was one such instruction. It spoke clearly, in smoke and steel, about the cost of trusting old truths too long. And even as armies adapted around it, others continued forward, believing the road would be safe this time. The guns, as always, were waiting to correct that belief. Long after the wreckage was cleared, the road returned to silence. New vehicles passed over the same strip of ground, civilian traffic, supply wagons, patrols moving without memory of what had burned there before. Asphalt was repaired. Ditches were filled. Grass grew back where shell craters had torn the earth open. To anyone arriving later, it looked like an ordinary road again. There was no memorial. No marker to explain why the ground had once been blackened, why fragments of twisted metal had been pulled from the soil. Roads are not places of remembrance. They are built to be used, not to be understood. The war moved on, and so did the people who passed through. The general did not become famous for what happened there. His decision was recorded, filed, absorbed into larger reports about operational failure and enemy capability. He was neither celebrated nor uniquely condemned. Like many officers, he was overtaken by events larger than himself, doctrine, habit, and a war that no longer rewarded what had once worked. What survived was not the man, but the lesson. Military doctrine adjusted. Firepower was given greater authority. Roads were reclassified from conveniences to risks. Movement was planned with the expectation of observation, not the hope of absence. Precision became a form of memory the war carried forward. And still, the road remained indifferent. It did not remember the engines, the smoke, or the 18 minutes that erased a column. It did not care who passed over it next. Only the guns remembered, because they had never forgotten what patience and preparation could do. They had waited once. They would wait again. They thought the road was safe. The guns remembered otherwise.